Let's continue in the Lucid Word, this brief explanation of the Summary of Obligatory Knowledge. The author says, Section 4, Performing the Obligations and Avoiding the Prohibitions. That's the minimum of what is incumbent upon each accountable person. If we wanted to summarize into one condensed expression, what is incumbent upon every accountable person? It is doing the obligations and avoiding the prohibitions. So the obligations are many, prohibitions are many. So if you do that, then you are a pious Muslim. If you do that consistently, along with some extra deed that you've done consistently and you didn't leave it out, at least one extra deed, then you can become a wali. You should know that every accountable person is obligated to perform all of what Allah made obligatory on them, such as prayer, zakah, fasting, returning what they have taken from people unjustly, etc. Subhanallah, I went through some thing with this capitalized zakah or not, or prayer or not. So if it's capitalized here only because it's Arabic transliteration, then that's not a reason to capitalize it. If we're going to capitalize zakah here, we should capitalize prayer and fasting also. So I started not capitalizing them. One must also perform that in the manner which Allah ordered, by fulfilling the integrals and the conditions of these obligatory matters. So this could be a new paragraph here. An integral is part of an act of worship that must be fulfilled, and without which the act is not valid. And a condition is a requirement that is not part of the worship, but without which the act of worship is not valid. So here, this definition here is limiting an integral to being an act of worship. And same thing, says a condition is a requirement that is not part of the worship, but without it, the act of worship is not valid. So I don't know what's in the Arabic. I don't have it here ready for me to look at. If it says ibadah there, or if it says something more open. Because really an integral is not restricted to worship. It also includes deals. Those are the two types of things you need to look into. Worships and deals. Anytime you want to do a worship, you want to know the integrals of that worship. The integral is a part of the act. So if the word worship is not in the Arabic, then it'd be enough to stop there. An integral is part of the act, whether it's a worship or a deal. If it is in the Arabic, then it's translated correctly, but also includes deals. This part of this act must be fulfilled, and without which the act is not valid. Here, you can put a period here. Start a new sentence. A condition is a requirement that is not part of the worship, not part of the act, whether it's a worship or a deal, but without which the act of worship or the deal is not valid. So an integral is a part of the act. It's a piece of the act. So like reciting Fatiha in prayer and bowing and prostrating in prayer, those are integrals of the prayer. A condition is not a part of the act, like wudu for prayer. Wudu is something else other than prayer. It's a condition for prayer. So an integral is an actual piece of the act. If the act were a body, then the integral would be an arm or a leg or a torso, for example, or a head. It's part of what makes that thing. So worships have integrals and deals have integrals. For example, the integrals of a marriage contract are a bride a groom, a guardian, witnesses, and statements. 5 things. Those are actual integrals. So if any one of them is missing, then an integral piece of the marriage contract is missing altogether. It's not valid. So, an integral is part of the act. It must be fulfilled, and without which the act is not valid. A condition is a requirement that is not part of the act, or you could use the word a prerequisite. If you want, prerequisite works well, especially that a condition has to be fulfilled before you do the deed in question. The condition has to be prior to the actual deed. Like wudu. You have to have wudu first, then you can pray. And the conditions also, let's say, for the marriage contract, the bride has conditions, like she's not already married, or she's not in the iddah. So that has to be fulfilled before you do the marriage contract. And and the groom has conditions, like if that's a Muslim woman, he's a Muslim man. And the guardian has conditions, and the witnesses have conditions, and the statements have conditions. If all those conditions are fulfilled, then you bring those 5 things, and then you do your marriage contract. Also, one must avoid doing their invalidators, falling into or performing an invalidator of the worship or the deal. If someone accountable knows of another person leaving out any of these obligations, or performing them incorrectly, leaving them out altogether, not doing them at all, or performing them incorrectly, we say incorrectly here, it's possible to do it incorrectly, but it's valid though. Sometimes the deed is not perfect, still valid though, didn't get invalidated. So if someone accountable knows of another person leaving out any of these obligations or performing them incorrectly in such a way that the obligation will not be fulfilled if one carries on, so that's what's meant here. Incorrectly meaning in an invalid way. He must order the wrongdoer to perform these obligations in the manner that will make them valid. These obligations in the manner that makes these obligations that will make them valid. And it is obligatory upon the accountable person, if he sees an individual performing his duties incorrectly, to force him to do so, i.e. to impose on him the performance of the obligations correctly, if one is able to compel and order the wrongdoer. And it is obligatory upon the accountable person, if he sees an individual performing his duties incorrectly, to force him to do so, i.e., to impose on him, this one who's doing it wrong, the performance of the obligations correctly, if one is able. The one who sees that wrongdoing, if he's able. If he's able to compel and order the wrongdoer. So, otherwise, one must denounce that wrongdoing in one's heart, yani in his own heart, when unable to force or order its change. Force, yani by hand, and order by tongue. He's unable to do either of those. Then he has to hate it in his heart. For this condemnation in the heart is the weakest degree of faith, i.e. the least that is required if unable to enact a change by physical or verbal means. It is obligatory upon the accountable person to leave out all the prohibited matters, yani not to do anything haram, both small and enormous, to forbid whoever commits them, and to forcefully prevent the wrongdoer by physical or verbal measures from committing them if able, provided that censoring the wrongdoer does not result in a graver sin than the original sin. Stopping this person is not going to result in a sin greater than the one you're warning from in the first place. Or else, if unable to eliminate it, one must reject those prohibited actions in his heart. The definition of unlawful haram is what Allah threatened its perpetrator with punishment, i.e., it is the misdeed which makes its committer deserving of punishment in the hereafter. And the haram is what Allah promised its avoider with reward. He promised its avoider with reward. And what's meant here is the one who avoids the haram, he gets reward if he avoids the haram in obedience. Yani, in compliance. Yani, with an intention. In other words, when it comes to doing something haram, you don't need an intention to do the haram thing and get the sin. If you did the haram, you'll get the sin without an intention. And if you don't do the haram, if you don't do something haram, then there's no reward for you just for not doing something haram only. Like right now, for example, you're listening to the lesson. Let's say you're not doing anything haram at the moment. So there's no reward for you for not drinking alcohol right now, or for not looking at a person of the opposite gender with desire right now, because you're just not doing it. So when do you get the reward for not doing haram? When you intend, or when you're avoiding that sin is out of obedience. Those mean same thing. Like, whether you said, now I'm going to not do this haram for the sake of Allah, that means you intended. Or if you said, I'm not going to do that because Allah made that haram, that's also having an intention. Because it means, I'm not going to do that out of obedience to Allah, so that's an intention. And so you'll get the reward, inshaAllah. Otherwise, you're just not doing it anyway, so you're just doing something else. So Allah promised the avoider of the haram with reward. That means when he avoids that in obedience. Same thing for the makruh. And the definition of obligatory, wajib, is its opposite. I.e., what Allah promised its doer with the purpose of following the order of Allah with reward, and threatened its neglector with punishment. So wajib is the opposite of haram, not halal. Someone would think halal is opposite of haram. Wajib or fard is the opposite of haram, because wajib or fard, obligatory, is that which Allah promised its doer with reward and threatened its neglector with punishment. So it came out the opposite of haram. He promised its doer with reward when he does that in compliance with the same condition. But here there's a difference between worships and contracts, which is that the worship needs an intention to be valid, and the contract does not need an intention to be valid. So when the person prays and makes the intention, it says, now I pray, and says in his heart, now I pray obligatory dhuhr prayer, for example. Now I make the intention to fast obligatory fasting tomorrow, for example. That's required for the worship to even be valid. So that's going to be done in compliance with God's command, yani, out of compliance and in obedience. And it's required even for the worship to be valid. As for a deal, it's not required to make an intention for the deal to be valid. But the intention is still required for the reward, if you want the reward. So, for example, a person feeds his wife and children with the obligatory support, and clothes his wife, for example, and lodges her. He brings her clothing of the season. Says, it's wintertime now. Here's a new outfit for you. So if he just gives it to her, he fulfills his obligation. If it fulfills the obligation, he fulfilled his obligation, even if he didn't intend. But if he wants the reward for that, then he makes the intention when he gives it to her. Because that's a deal. Or a dealing. Any question? You said, if a Muslim intends to stay away from the makruh also, is it also rewardable? Yes, it is. By definition, it is, yes. Because makruh means if you do it, there's no punishment. But if you avoid it, then it's rewardable. So what does halal mean in this case? Halal is broad. It covers more than one thing. Because makruh is halal. Makruh, which is disliked, is still halal. So halal means permissible, but in a broad sense. Not exactly the opposite of haram. So, for example, eating with your left hand, that's halal. It's not haram. It's halal. It's not rewardable, though, if you don't have an excuse. Yani, it's not sunnah. It's not recommended. Tayyib. So, I'd like to do a short lesson for today, insha'Allah ta'ala. So, if you will permit me, we'll stop here. And then next week, insha'Allah, we'll start from the top of the book of purification and prayer.